Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
It was about 10 minutes after my mom said, "Your brother's new wife is so classy. You should learn from her," that a black limo pulled up outside her perfect little colonial house, right in the middle of our annual Easter lunch, and every single person at that table went dead silent. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, brushed the crumbs off my lap, adjusted my cardigan like it was just another Tuesday, and walked out the door without saying goodbye. That wasn't the part that stunned them. It was the fact that when I reached the car, the driver actually opened the door for me, said my name like I was someone important, and the moment I got inside, Tiffany, my brother's supposedly flawless new wife, turned ghost white, like she'd just seen the end of her own show. But let me back up a bit. That explosion didn't come out of nowhere. See, every single year since I was 12, Easter lunch at my mom's house has been this weird mix of formality, passive aggression, and fake pastel cheer. There's the china that only comes out twice a year, the same ham with the same dry cornbread stuffing, and of course the unspoken contest of which child has disappointed mom the least this year. Spoiler alert, it's never me. My name's Jenna. I'm 32, single, no kids, no husband, and according to my mother, who once told me my haircut looked unmarriageable, I'm pretty much the cautionary tale in a Banana Republic blouse. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't hate my mom, but she's the kind of woman who thinks being honest means pointing out every single thing you're doing wrong, and she spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of smiling while cutting you down in front of people. My brother Ethan, on the other hand, could set the house on fire, and she'd still compliment him on how decisive he is. Ethan was always the golden boy. Football in high school, scholarship to Notre Dame, married the first girl she actually liked, and then, after they divorced, he somehow leveled up by meeting Tiffany, who walked into our lives wearing pearls, heels, and an air of superiority that immediately made my mom act like she'd birthed her. Tiffany isn't stupid. She knows how to work a room. She knows just how many questions to ask about your career before pretending to be impressed. And she knows how to look humble while bragging. Within 10 minutes of sitting down at the Easter table, she'd already told us about the charity gala she helped coordinate, translation, took pictures at, the client brunch she hosted at a country club, and how exhausting it is trying to manage personal branding in your late 20s. Meanwhile, I was seated across from her in a Target dress that I didn't have time to iron because I'd just come back from an early morning catering gig, one of 4 I'd booked for the holiday weekend. Now, catering might not sound glamorous, and that's probably because I don't go around making it look like a lifestyle brand. But I run a company that services some of the highest-end private events in the city. I don't post about it. I don't show off pictures. I don't explain myself to people who still think real jobs require cubicles. But Tiffany? Oh, she had to know. Or maybe she just assumed I was still figuring things out, the way my mom always puts it when she explains me to new people. So we're sitting there, plates filled, Tiffany launching into some story about a yacht party they attended with one of Ethan's work clients. And my mom, not even waiting for a natural pause, leans over, rests her hand gently on mine, and drops the line like she's announcing the weather. "Your brother's new wife is so classy. You really should learn from her." And it was like the air left the room. Everyone heard it. No one flinched. Except me. I smiled. I didn't flinch either. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened a message I'd pre-written and stared at all morning, and hit send. It just said, "Now." My mom kept talking like nothing had happened. Tiffany chuckled and reached for her wine. My Aunt Debbie tried to pivot the conversation to some story about her dog's surgery. Ethan kept eating, like he always does when he's uncomfortable. And I waited. I didn't say a word for 10 minutes. I ate a few more bites of ham. I even asked Tiffany a question about her new job at the firm, and she launched into some vague PR speak about brand strategy and audience engagement, like she was pitching a TED Talk. Then, like clockwork, we all heard the sound of tires on gravel. Now, here's what you have to know about my family, especially Claire, my mother. Appearances are everything. So when a black Lincoln limo pulled into our cul-de-sac and parked right in front of her white fence lawn, she looked like someone had just walked in wearing sweatpants to a wedding. She squinted at the window, trying to pretend like she wasn't bothered, but I saw the way her hand tightened around her water glass. The driver stepped out. Tall, sharp suit, mirrored glasses, walked up the front walk, paused at the porch, and then knocked. 3 soft, polite taps. I stood up. Not fast, just casually. My mom blinked at me. "Where are you going?" she asked. I didn't look at her. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and smoothed out my skirt. Then I turned and smiled at Tiffany, leaned down like I was going to kiss her cheek, and said softly enough that only she could hear, "Tell Ethan I said congratulations. And good luck." That's when the color drained from her face. I walked out the front door, past my uncle's rusted Ford, past the tulips she planted every spring since I was 8, and slid into the back of that limo like I did it every day of the week. The door closed behind me, the engine purred, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. They were all still sitting there with their forks in midair. And it was only Easter Sunday. If you ever want to understand the slow, sticky burn of being compared to someone your whole life, not just in passing, but in a way that seeps into every interaction and clings to you like the scent of cigarette smoke in a diner booth, then you need to grow up as the second child in a house where the first child can do no wrong. And not because he's flawless, but because your mother decided long ago that perfection wasn't about truth, but about narrative. And Ethan's story was the one she'd already written cover to cover before I was even born. My earliest memory of feeling like a shadow instead of a daughter was during a 2nd grade spelling bee. I came in 2nd place and practically flew off the stage with excitement, holding my little ribbon like it was Olympic gold. But all my mom said was that Ethan had won 1st place at that age, and maybe if I practiced harder, next year could be different. That one sentence might have been forgettable if it had stood alone. But it didn't. It became the soundtrack to my adolescence, playing on a loop. Ethan did this. Ethan never did that. Ethan's report card. Ethan's girlfriend. Ethan's internship. Ethan's wedding. And I learned painfully early that applause was only offered when it mirrored what had already been done, not when it forged a new path entirely. As we got older, the contrast only sharpened. Ethan became the easy narrative. A football star in high school with an easy smile and good posture, someone who somehow always got his homework done without staying up all night, the kind of guy who could charm your teacher into giving him an extension just by looking tired and saying, "I'm sorry." Meanwhile, I was the one who colored outside the lines, both literally and metaphorically. I wanted to cook instead of cheerlead, preferred books over parties, didn't have a straight-line plan from high school to adulthood, and my rebellion wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quieter, the kind that comes from choosing different instead of better. I remember once, in my mid-20s, after I'd left my 3rd miserable office job and was working part-time at a bakery while freelancing catering gigs on weekends, my mom sat me down at that same kitchen table she used for every holiday spread and said, with her voice all smooth and deliberate, "You know, I'm not judging, Jenna, but your brother had a house and a wife by your age. Maybe you need a little more structure." I laughed because it was easier than screaming, but what I really wanted to say was that structure had always meant submission in our family, following the path, doing what made everyone else comfortable, even if it made you slowly rot inside. The thing is, Ethan isn't a bad guy. He's actually decent in that frustrating, affable way that makes you want to hate him, but you can't because he doesn't seem to realize just how much the game was rigged in his favor. He never gloated. He never rubbed it in he didn't need to. The world did that for him. And when he met Tiffany, I almost let myself hope for 5 seconds that maybe things would shift. Maybe this woman, so poised, so put together, so unnaturally perfect, would be the thing that made people finally realize that chasing appearances doesn't always mean substance. But instead, Tiffany slid into our family like a silver spoon dipped in champagne, immediately earning Claire's adoration with her carefully curated grace and Pinterest board wardrobe. It wasn't enough that she looked like she stepped out of a boutique window. She also had that exhausting skill of making everything sound humble while actually flexing. When she said she helped plan a charity event, It turned out she took photos for the newsletter. When she mentioned her clients, she meant 2 family friends she posted sponsored skincare reviews for on Instagram. But Claire didn't care about the details. She cared about the packaging. And Tiffany knew exactly how to wrap herself. By the time that limo pulled away from the curb last Sunday, I knew what I'd just done had landed like a rock in a glass house. I could feel the silence vibrating behind me, even as the driver asked where to next. I told him the hotel, same as planned, and then leaned back into the plush leather seat, letting the calm wash over me, not the smug kind of calm, but the kind that comes from realizing you don't owe anyone an explanation anymore, especially not people who have spent years making you feel like a draft version of someone else's success story. The hotel wasn't just any hotel. It was the Grand Meridian downtown, the one with the rooftop terrace overlooking the river, the place that charges more for an appetizer than my mother's entire Easter spread. I wasn't going there for drinks or dinner. I was going there to meet a client, one of the biggest I'd landed in the last year, and oversee a corporate anniversary event that my company had been planning for months. It wasn't a fluke gig, it was a 6-figure deal, but that wasn't the point. The point was, nobody in that dining room had a single clue what I actually do. They still think I make cupcakes for birthday parties. They don't know I've built a team of 10 people, that I've catered events for judges and politicians and musicians they'd recognize. They don't know I've turned down jobs that Tiffany would beg to photograph. And I've kept it that way. Not because I'm hiding, but because I stopped needing their approval somewhere between my second eviction notice and my first profit margin that hit 6 figures. As I stepped out of the car and onto the marble steps, my phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "Everything okay?" It almost made me laugh. He meant well, he always did, but he never knew how to see past the obvious. I started to type a response, paused, and then deleted it. Instead, I sent him a photo, a simple one, of the rooftop terrace, already glowing with candles and white linen, the skyline cutting across the horizon like a promise, no caption, no explanation. Let him wonder. Let all of them wonder. Because the next move wasn't theirs. It was mine. And I wasn't done yet. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing something no one else in the room is even aware could be known. A kind of quiet power that doesn't need to be flaunted or forced. Just held onto patiently until the time is right. And when it finally is, when all the right pieces are in place, and the people who thought they were playing you finally realize they were on the wrong side of the chessboard the whole time, it becomes something far more potent than revenge. It becomes proof that you never needed to shout to be heard. You just needed to wait. Sitting on the rooftop of the Grand Meridian, sipping a drink I didn't have to pay for while my staff finalized the last few details for the event, I couldn't help but think back to the moment I first realized Tiffany was not who she pretended to be. It wasn't a single moment of revelation, not some scandalous discovery in a drawer or a dropped diary page filled with secrets. It was gradual, subtle, like a smell you can't quite place until it suddenly makes your stomach turn. The first time was back at Ethan's engagement dinner, where Tiffany told the story of how they met. Twice in the same evening, with completely different details each time. The first version was in a museum, the second in a coffee shop near his office. When I asked her about the inconsistency later, she laughed and said she was just romanticizing the timeline, which might have passed as harmless if it weren't for the glint of calculation in her eyes. Over the months that followed, little cracks started to show, barely visible, but impossible to ignore once noticed. She once told Claire she had a master's degree in marketing, but I overheard her on the phone with someone from her agency, nervously asking what a client's target demo meant. I also remembered seeing her Instagram bio change 3 times in the same week, jumping from digital strategist to lifestyle consultant to personal brand coach, like she was throwing darts at a wall of vague professions and seeing what stuck. Most of the family, including Ethan, either didn't notice or didn't care. My mom certainly didn't. Claire was too busy being enamored by Tiffany's wardrobe and her filtered photos to question where the money or credibility came from. But I noticed, and unlike the rest of them, I didn't just roll my eyes and move on. I started paying attention, not because I wanted to expose her for sport, but because I had a sinking feeling that my brother, as emotionally absent as he could be, was being taken for a ride. And the more I watched, the more convinced I became that Tiffany was not just playing a role, she was constructing a facade, a persona so meticulously curated that she had started believing in it herself. But if there's one thing I've learned running a business, especially in an industry where image can outshine quality in a heartbeat, it's that a well-built illusion always has one thing in common: a weak foundation. The tipping point came 3 weeks before Easter, when my assistant, Marcy, sent me a message during a staff meeting with a link to a private catering blog post from a chef's forum we sometimes network through. "Hey boss," she wrote, "isn't this your brother's fiancé?" The post included photos from a private party in Miami, dated just over 6 months ago, showing none other than Tiffany in a completely different context, lounging poolside with a man who most definitely was not Ethan, clinking glasses and wearing a ring that didn't match the one I'd seen her flaunt on Instagram. I didn't jump to conclusions. I clicked through the photographer's site, checked metadata, confirmed locations, and then, just to be sure, I forwarded it to a friend in PR I'd worked with before, someone who specialized in background checks for celebrity clients, and asked for a quiet, unofficial scan of Tiffany's social media trail. What came back wasn't scandalous in the dramatic sense. No arrests, no aliases, no secret double life. But it was enough to paint a very different picture of the woman my family had all but canonized. Tiffany had spent the last 4 years reinventing herself every time she moved cities, each time tweaking her career story, just enough to sound credible while deleting or archiving anything that might contradict it. She had previously been engaged twice before Ethan, one of which ended less than a year before she met him. And both men, public figures in local business scenes, had gone radio silent about the breakups. More than that, she'd spent most of her 20s hopping between consultant roles that never lasted more than 3 months, often paid under the table, with glowing online profiles but no real credentials to back them up. Now, I had all this information in my pocket, and the old me might have marched into Easter with a printed packet of evidence like a prosecutor at a family trial. But I've learned something over the years, something that only comes from being talked over, underestimated, and dismissed often enough to make you dangerous. The best revenge isn't explosive, it's surgical. It's slow, quiet, and leaves the other person wondering whether they destroyed themselves without you ever lifting a hand. That's why, instead of confronting Tiffany or warning Ethan outright, I texted someone else, a man named Ryan, someone I hadn't seen in over 2 years, but who once shared a hotel bar with me after a particularly brutal wedding gig, where we'd both ended up alone and tipsy enough to talk about life without filters. Ryan had once dated Tiffany, briefly but memorably, and he'd been the one to end it after realizing she was stringing along another guy in her network at the same time. At the time, it hadn't felt like a big deal to me. Now it was starting to look like a missing puzzle piece. When I walked into the hotel ballroom that day, past servers dressed in black and white, past tables draped in cream linens, and glasses arranged with surgical precision, I found Ryan standing at the bar exactly where I'd asked him to wait. He looked older than I remembered, a little more weathered, but with that same calm, analytical gaze. I greeted him with a simple nod, and he handed me his phone without saying a word. On the screen was an old photo, a screen grab from an account Tiffany had once used under a slightly different name, featuring a caption that read, "Life's a game. Just make sure you're the one moving the pieces." It wasn't incriminating, not legally, not even morally by some standards, but it said everything I needed it to. This wasn't a woman who had simply evolved. This was someone who had weaponized reinvention as a lifestyle, and if there was one thing Claire hated more than being shown up, it was being made to look gullible. I didn't know yet how I would use it. I didn't even know if I would. But the truth was mine now, and the next move was up to me. What mattered wasn't that I had the upper hand. It was that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was playing defense in a family that never thought I had anything to say. And that feeling, that calm, calculated certainty, that was worth more than any applause they'd never given me. If there's one thing I've come to understand about my mother, deeply, painfully, and in the sort of way that seeps into your bones over time, it's that she doesn't fear being wrong nearly as much as she fears being embarrassed. And for Claire Reynolds, embarrassment isn't just about spilled wine on a white blouse or a neighbor seeing a garden left untrimmed. It's about control, about preserving the pristine image of the family she believes she's curated with the same meticulousness that she arranges her china cabinet. And the moment something threatens that image, she reacts not with introspection or humility, but with a surge of defensiveness so polished and pleasant that it can take days, weeks even, to realize she's managed to flip the story entirely and cast herself as the wronged party in a narrative she authored herself. After I left Easter lunch in that limo, after I stepped off her property without looking back and rode off towards something she could neither predict nor control, the fallout didn't hit immediately, and I knew better than to expect it would. My mother doesn't explode. She doesn't confront. She lets silence do the work first, letting you stew in the implication that you've caused a disruption, that you've ruined the meal or embarrassed the family, and only once you've had time to reflect, when you're vulnerable or hungry for reconnection, does she swoop in with her tidy, passive-aggressive lectures disguised as invitations to talk things through like adults. And true to form, she waited 3 days before sending the first message. It wasn't a question or an expression of concern. It wasn't even a disguised demand. It was a single sentence, as polished and sharp as a pearl earring. You certainly made an impression on Sunday. No punctuation, no warmth, just a cold, weighty sentence designed to prod without breaking the surface. And I stared at it for a full minute before simply locking my phone and turning it face down. I didn't respond, not yet. Because what Claire didn't know, what Ethan didn't know, and certainly what Tiffany didn't know, was that Easter was not the crescendo of my story. It was the opening act. And while my mother sat in her lavender-painted dining room, picking at the memory of my exit like it was a stain on her upholstery, I was already steps ahead, laying the groundwork for something they couldn't dismiss or talk over, something undeniable and precise. Something that wouldn't just force them to see me clearly, but would make them question everything they thought they understood about who held the power in this family. But while I was waiting for the right moment, the House of Reynolds was already beginning to crack. According to Marcy, who couldn't help herself and scrolled through Tiffany's socials like they were tabloids, there was a shift in the tone of her posts. The usual blessed and grateful captions turned into vague, cryptic ones about loyalty, trust, and staying authentic. Her carefully arranged selfies were still coming, but now with comments mysteriously turned off and no tags linking back to Ethan. Meanwhile, Ethan himself had texted me twice, once to check in, and another time more directly, asking, "Did something happen with Tiffany I should know about?" Which I didn't answer. He was already unraveling the threads, probably starting to realize that the woman who smiled so sweetly across from him at dinner might have been performing more than just polite conversation. Back at the family home, Claire was doing what she always did when things didn't go her way. She rewrote the narrative to fit her worldview, a world where she wasn't the instigator, but the victim of her ungrateful daughter's sudden rudeness. I know this because my Aunt Debbie called me, under the guise of just checking in, but quickly mentioned how your mother says you stormed out in some dramatic fashion, which was laughable because I hadn't stormed anywhere. I'd walked, calm and silent, like someone who didn't owe the room a thing. But despite her retelling, I knew the seeds had been planted. Ethan was asking questions, Tiffany was spiraling, and Claire, for all her emotional maneuvering, was slowly beginning to feel something she hadn't felt from me in years. Distance she couldn't bridge with a phone call or a guilt trip. Meanwhile, I was getting closer to the final piece. It started with a message from Ryan, sent late at night, accompanied by a photo I hadn't seen before. This one was different. It wasn't a party scene or a flirty pose. It was a screenshot of a text thread between our Tiffany and someone listed only as B. Short messages, vague references to keeping things quiet, and playing the part until the money's handled. There was nothing concrete enough to expose her as a con artist, nothing scandalous enough to get her canceled in today's world, but it painted a clear enough picture. Tiffany wasn't just a woman who liked to reinvent herself. She was strategic. She picked partners based on potential. She told someone she was with Ethan because it made things easier, because his job was stable, and his family old money, which was ironic considering Claire had been cutting coupons out of grocery store flyers just 2 years ago when my dad's pension hit a rough patch. I kept all of this to myself for now, not because I wanted to torture anyone with suspense, but because it wasn't the right time yet. I had to let them come to me, and I could feel that moment approaching like a storm on the horizon. So when Claire, ever the tactician, finally called me, voice calm, demeanor falsely sweet, and asked if I would consider coming to Sunday dinner to clear the air, I said yes, not because I wanted to be part of the reconciliation fantasy she'd already built in her head, but because I knew that returning to the scene of the crime, so to speak, would give me the perfect setting for what came next. I arrived 10 minutes early, a bottle of wine in hand, and a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, and took my place at the table without fanfare. Tiffany was there, looking tense and overly composed, her smile rigid and eyes darting like she was waiting for a bomb to drop. Ethan, quiet as ever, kept glancing between us, and Claire, dressed in her softest cardigan like she was starring in her own forgiveness-themed Hallmark movie, opened the meal with a toast about family healing and moving forward. And I raised my glass gently and said nothing, not yet. Because Sunday dinner had just begun, and no one realized the real conversation hadn't even started. There's a certain stillness that settles over a room right before the truth decides to walk in. And it's never loud, never theatrical the way people expect justice or revelation to be. It's quiet, deliberate, almost respectful in the way a predator moves just before it strikes. And as I sat there at my mother's dining room table during that Sunday dinner, she had so carefully orchestrated to act as a bandage over the family tension she still refused to acknowledge. I could feel that stillness humming underneath every bite of pot roast, and every forced compliment passed across the table like it could glue back together all the cracks that had long since split our relationships down the middle. Claire, ever the hostess, had gone out of her way to make everything appear normal. Fresh flowers on the table, cloth napkins folded into tulips, a lemon cake on the counter with just the right amount of powdered sugar dusted over it like snow, and a smile that she wore so tightly it looked like it might crack if she breathed wrong. But her eyes kept flicking toward me in that calculating way she always had when she wasn't sure whether I was going to play along or start setting fire to the fantasy she had built out of this dinner. Tiffany sat beside Ethan, posture unnaturally perfect, lips painted too red for a casual meal, with a tension in her jaw that betrayed just how hard she was working to keep up her usual smooth demeanor. And Ethan, poor Ethan, seemed like he was bracing for an earthquake that hadn't yet arrived, but that he somehow knew was hiding beneath the floorboards of this carefully constructed peace offering. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not angry or bitter or even hurt by any of it, but oddly detached, as though I had finally stepped outside the emotional gravity of this family and could see everything for what it was, not a gathering meant to reconcile, but a performance meant to preserve an illusion that had stopped meaning anything to me years ago. The dinner dragged on with the usual niceties, small talk about weather and work and meaningless updates that danced around the real issues like frightened animals circling a predator. And every time Claire tried to nudge the conversation toward some sanitized version of the past week's events, "We've all had a little stress," she said once, with that soft voice she used when she was preparing to rewrite reality. I just nodded, smiled, and let the silence stretch out long enough to make her uncomfortable, because I knew she was waiting for me to apologize, to explain, to put the pieces back where she wanted them. But what she didn't know, or maybe what she refused to believe, was that I wasn't here to make peace. I was here to finish something. So when the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured and everyone was beginning to relax, thinking the worst had passed, I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain envelope. Not thick, not dramatic, just simple and white, and handed it across the table to my mother with a steady hand and an unreadable expression. She took it slowly, like it might contain a bill or a subpoena, and opened it with that tight-lipped frown she reserved for anything that came uninvited. Inside, she found a glossy, professionally printed invitation, an elegant cardstock piece with gold foil edges and embossed lettering that read, "You are cordially invited to the 5th Annual Meridian Gala, proudly catered and co-sponsored by Juniper and Rye Events, founder and creative director, Jenna Reynolds." I watched her eyes move across the card, narrowing with each word, and then looked up at me with a mix of confusion and something dangerously close to disbelief. "I thought you said you were still doing catering," she said finally, not understanding that what she'd meant as a casual dismissal now landed like an insult against an empire. "I am," I said, smiling. "That's my company. I built it, from scratch. We handle high-profile events across the state. And last weekend, while you were talking about Tiffany's class, I was hosting 300 guests from the business elite, a senator, 2 state Supreme Court justices, and the CEO of a Fortune 500 company." The room went still again, utterly still, and for the first time since the night I moved out of that house for good, no one had anything to say. Ethan looked stunned, as though realizing he'd missed an entire chapter of his sister's life, and Tiffany, whose smile had not returned since I walked in, glanced down at her lap like she was trying to avoid being seen. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Claire, whose face had gone pale and taut, her hands frozen on the edge of the invitation, and spoke with a calmness I had never been allowed to possess in her house. "That woman you told me to learn from, the one who was supposed to be my example of grace and success, she was engaged to a man in Miami 6 months before Ethan, while she was living in another man's guest house and posting fake business retreats from Airbnbs. She didn't just lie to you, Mom. She sold you a version of herself you wanted to believe in so badly you never thought to question why none of it added up." Claire opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "I'm not saying this to humiliate you," I said. "I'm saying it because for once you need to understand that being quiet doesn't mean being clueless, and not demanding your respect every minute of the day doesn't mean I don't deserve it." Ethan stood, mouth half open, eyes flicking toward Tiffany, who had gone stiff and glassy-eyed, and in the silence that followed I pushed back my chair and stood as well, folding my napkin with deliberate care. "I don't need an apology," I said, reaching for my coat. "I don't need validation. I don't even need you to believe me. I just wanted you to know that I see everything clearly now, who you are, who I am, and how long I've let myself be treated like I was still the version of me you decided was a disappointment 20 years ago." As I walked to the door, I paused and turned just once more. "Oh, and since you're so fond of gestures, I sent a car to pick you up next week," I said. "You can come to the gala if you want, but if you do, you'll come as a guest, not as someone to be impressed, and certainly not as someone whose opinion still dictates what I'm worth." Then I walked outside, the evening air sharp and bracing, and for a moment I stood still, not because I was waiting for something, but because it felt good. No, it felt right to stand in front of that house, no longer looking for approval, no longer weighed down by the need to explain myself. And when the vehicle finally pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the dusk, it wasn't a limo this time. It was a food truck. My food truck. Wrapped in navy and gold, clean and bold, with my company name in crisp lettering across the side, and the tagline underneath that read, "We don't follow recipes, we create them." As I stepped up to the window and greeted my team, laughter echoing from the prep station in the back, I didn't have to look behind me to know that Claire had come to the door, drawn by the sound or the light, or perhaps just the truth finally catching up to her. She stood there, in her pristine cardigan, watching as I put on my apron and got to work. And for once, I didn't care whether she approved or not, because I wasn't part of her story anymore. She was part of mine.